Has the conversation in your marriage gotten dull, boring? Does it feel like you have nothing to talk about and usually you're talking about either the kids, the pets, or work, and that's it? Well, if that's the case, usually when the conversation and communication breaks down in a marriage, so does everything else. And so when we're dealing with the communication breakdown in a marriage, what happens is we eventually seem to separate. And it seems like we're going through the motions. We check in with each other. We learn logistics. I'll be here at this time. I'm doing this at this time. But there's no communication intimacy. There's no conversation that has depth. And you're not really getting to learn about each other anymore. And most people find themselves in this situation. What do? They find someone to talk to. They reach out to a friend, or they find someone else that they can have that conversation. And that can be helpful because we all need other people in our lives. But sometimes that can also be a problem too, because we just say, hey, I'm going to avoid this issue over here. I'm going to keep doing status quo. And I found someone that I can communicate here. And I think what we need to do is we can still have those friends around us that we can communicate with. We can still have those people that we can have those in-depth conversations because we need that. But we need to begin to cultivate a communication in our marriage. And we need to try to figure out, how do we do that? How do we have some of the deep discussions? And we can't have huge, deep discussions if we're not communicating. So we got to open that door to communication somehow. And I figured that the way to do that is the big questions we have. Like, what do we want to do with our life? Where do we see ourselves in 10 years? What do we want to create? What do we want? Even asking ourselves about the state of the country, how we feel about that, or how we feel about just big ideas, maybe taking on a new hobby or doing something, but something that actually has depth, something that's not necessarily about you and them, but something that's really about you in a way that reveals more about yourself. And then asking them questions that you can understand more about them as well, because I think that many of us have gotten into the point where the conversation in the marriage, you don't talk about anything. You don't talk about anything at all. And there's nothing to talk about. And so we got to open the door somehow, because until we have this conversation and open up communication and talk about things that actually have depth, until we do that, we can't do the rest of the stuff. We can't get the emotional or physical intimacy. We can't have that. Also, there's a trust breakdown as well. So one of the considerations that I have for you today to think about is, if you have a tendency of avoiding it, not talking, what are some things that you've been holding on to that you want to talk about? What are some things that really matter to you that you feel like you're stifling in the relationship and not talking about? And slowly bringing up some of these things in the relationship, slowly talking about it, maybe going on a walk together or doing something that's not your normal routine, because we got to get out of this rut. We got to get out of the rut that we're in. And that's what happens a lot, is we get into this rut. We do the same thing every day. We eat at the same time, or we go to the same restaurant every time you go out to eat. You talk about the same thing. And, many of you might be over drinking at the restaurant because you're trying to mellow out, or you don't know how to conversate or don't know how to communicate. And we might be using, alcohol as a way to kind of break that barrier. And that's fine, but I don't want us depending on these types of things. I think we need to sit there and say, okay, what do I really want to discuss? And what is a discussion that I would have with a friend of mine that I feel like I can't have it with my spouse? Is there do these discussions exist? And I think many of you would have to say yes. You found an outside source or somebody that you can communicate. But what are some of those things that you talk about that you can talk about in your marriage? And what are some of the big questions that you can ask your spouse to get them to open up a little bit more? Because a lot of people are dealing with avoidance issues. If you look at attachment styles are very important to understand. When we understand our attachment style, we've done a few videos on attachment styles before, and we can link those right now. And there's also an attachment style quiz that you can take as well to understand better. But once we understand our attachment style, we understand why we communicate the way we do, or why we don't communicate, or why we avoid, or why we get anxious when somebody's avoiding us. So it really helps us to understand that. But that communication is key, because without opening the deep communication, we really truly don't have anything. If we can't talk about our feelings, if we can't talk about things that matter to us, and we can't talk about those big ticket items that are important to us, then we don't really have a marriage. We have what I call the roommate situation. And again, this has to be the pinnacle piece to begin to open the door. So some of you say, we haven't had sex in a long time. We don't have intimacy. We don't have this. We don't have that. But you have to admit, for the most part, the conversation and the communication has completely broken down. And so asking yourself, what can you talk about? Slowly, talking with your spouse, asking good questions, having some fun, opening that doorway and trying, because the last thing we want to do is we don't want to leave a marriage when we haven't tried and exhausted all opportunities. We want to exhaust all opportunities to make sure that we're doing the right thing. If you try to communicate, I know many of you might say, hey, Ashley, I've been trying for a long time, but why don't you give it another try? Because otherwise, what are we really doing here? We're in a limbo situation where we're not happy. And you have to admit, if there's no communication, the other person has to feel it too. Okay, they just might not be talking about it. So one person might be more avoidant, one person might be more anxious, or one person might be more secure, but somehow or not, we have to take this on, and you have to be the leader in the marriage. If this is happening, somebody's got to take it on, and I think you would be the best person to take this on and say, okay, how do I open this communication? What are the conversations we can have? What are some topics that are important to me that we don't talk about? And slowly do this over a period of time and see if your spouse will communicate back. And that'll be a good telltale sign to see where you are and to see if we can resurrect some of this in this marriage. But the biggest thing too is that we can always go outside of the marriage to have the conversations with other people, but you've chosen to live with this person, you've chosen to have kids with this person, you've chosen to do whatever with this person. Let's see if we can rebuild that relationship, or maybe build it solidly for the first time. But we have to open the door of communication first before any of those other things can happen. So if you're missing out on other things in the marriage, this is the first thing we have to go through. If you like this type of content and you're interested in more information on how to resurrect the marriage out of the roommate situation, or how to deal with these types of relationships, definitely please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And by the way, if you're dealing with this, how are you dealing with it? How are you, in the comment section, let me know, how are you working to open the lines of communication in your marriage? And if you are working at it and you're seeing some success, let us know what you're seeing. I mean, if you're not having success, let us know what you're feeling, because this is important. A lot of people are in this situation. You are not alone. And the only way that we can change the situation is communication and understanding how to open these doors to communicate, how to do that. And that's the only thing that's going to change the situation. Oh, and I almost forgot. Don't forget to live your true life.